Recording in progress.
Do you want me to turn it off?
If you plan to record it, but you have to tell everyone, you should check.
I have to record it, or I guess I don't, but we've always done it and posted it. Now, how do I share my screen?
The green button is that it?
This one? Oh,
That one.
all right. This will get you off.
And then you can do your whole screen or just.
So this. Do we need participants? That could you choose somewhere. Is this just showing my screen without being in the?
Because I can't log in, I can't tell. You get it? I'm not sure.
He's in.
Yeah, my email.
Yeah, you sent it to me.
Yeah. So yeah, put in my email. I'm trying to ask them to do some of these this password.
Can you guys see whether participants showing up?
I'm not in. Oh, no, oh, sorry, I see the top is 20.
So do you see that?
At the top of your screen, so participants.
Up there. I also don't. Well, I don't know how I switch it to. I don't know how I would switch. You can just talk. I don't know how I get Jason. Do you see that, or do you know?
Or he could just unmute himself and then talk. His slides.
Hello, can people hear me for this webinar? Did somebody raise their hand? Okay, thank you. We'll get started in a couple minutes here. And can you can see my screen? Great.
No,
I
you
could
don't
have
have-
sent you a separate log.
you don't
Okay, I think we'll get started. This is the information seminar for compliance filing for calendar year, compliance year 2022. I'm John Wasson, the RPS APS program manager at DUER. In the room, we have a few guests, Sue Ann Richardson from MassDEP, Catherine from MassDEP, and Matt from MassDEP as well. We first will go through this PowerPoint presentation, and then we will go through the workbook. It is almost in its final stage. It should be posted this afternoon, is our hope. The filing process is basically the same as it always been. The one difference this year is that it will be due on Monday, July 3rd, because July 1st falls on a Saturday this year. July 3rd is not a holiday for the state government, so that it is a business day, and that's when it will be due. We sent out bank certificates that were available to suppliers in April. We recently sent out the retail load obligation in mid-May. You should contact us if you have questions on that load obligation. It is from detail from the electric distribution companies. That is what we use finally for determining the load obligation. We do not use GIS or any other source for the load obligation. Reminder that the workbook will be posted today. The instructions, I'm hoping tomorrow or at least Tuesday of next week. A reminder that in the Q4 trading is midnight on June 15th, and all settled recs must be in your Massachusetts sub-account by then. As a reminder, if you owe any ACP this year, again, RPS, APS, and CPS must be submitted to MassCEC. We're suggesting by Wednesday, June 28th, so that a receipt can be returned to you so that you can submit it with your filing on July 3rd. ACPs for CES and CESE go through a different process. MassDEP will send out an invoice for any ACP after they receive the filings, and then payment is due to MassDEP, not CEC, within 30 days of receipt of the invoice from MassDEP. Monday, July 3rd is the deadline, and again, you can file. We now only accept electronic filing. You do not have to submit a hard copy or mail a hard copy, but included in the filing must be a copy of the filing workbook in Excel format, preferably, or required. Any GIS settlement reports, and CPS, the Clean Peak Standard, is done separately. So if you have CPACs, you would have to find a separate report on GIS to report those. And then any receipt from MassCEC showing payment of of the ACP. So those would all be due to doer.rps@mass.gov. New this year, there's only one change this year from last. That is, there are new wire instructions for MassDEP. They informed us, so we will be, MassDEP will send out an encrypted email with those wire instructions to everybody. So just be aware that last year's wire instructions will no longer work. But that's the only change for this year. Again, notarization, these are just reminders. Notarization is no longer required on the authorization form. Not necessary to send a hard copy. E-signatures acceptable as an alternative. A lot of suppliers print, sign, and scan both the certification and authorization and send that along with their filing as a PDF file, and that is perfectly acceptable as well. And then just a reminder, if you would run your GIS reports a couple days after June 15th, sometimes people run them too early and not all transactions get recorded through that process. And it's better to wait a couple days so that everything goes through on the GIS side. And a reminder, I think we have something later, show this later, that you have the ability now to run a complete calendar year of your GIS transactions. So they allow you to choose from the first quarter to the fourth quarter in one batch, and it's no longer necessary. And we prefer the full calendar year as a report. So you don't have to send them separately quarter by quarter. Bank certificates, nothing's changed. These are the same limits as last year. And no, nothing unusual or change. Reminder to settle all certificates and Massachusetts subcounts by June 15th. SREC and SREC 2 reminted auction certificates should be reported with your regular recs that you report. Do not include them in the errant or bank columns. They're just considered regular a rec. Again, you would, if you intended to have any certificates banked, you would include those certificates, report those certificates, and if you are reporting any green certificates, so it would be over and above the minimum obligation, those should be reported as well. And that's the voluntary green. But these are not the certificates that you would settle in your reserve account. Those are separate and should not be included here. Again, there are 2 GIS reports may be required, 2 if you have CPACs reporting. And if you don't have CPACs, then only the 1 GIS report is required. And again, in the filters, it's helpful if you just collect the settled only certificates, not including anything else that would have been banked or other categories that they have. And a reminder that the at least the GIS report should be sent in CSV form, preferably both CPEX and the GIS for RPS would be submitted in CSV format as one entire year. These are just solar carve out practices, solar SREC. Well, SCO 1 and SCO 2 are carve outs as usual of the RPS class 1 program. And this goes through, just suggests what happens to those certificates. We will be holding an auction this year again on before July 31st. I do not, or DOER does not assume that there will be a significant number of auction certificates available this year, as it appears that the minimum standard obligation is greater than the number of GIS certificates produced. So again, if you had certificates from last year, you can use them. There were only, I think there were only 80 certificates remaining from the year before. Those would have to be used this year or they would expire. Again, the solar carve out is bifurcated, but we do have other exemptions for other categories. We just showed the solar carve out. So there's a negligible amount of contracts that would be 4628.13 at this point. And they were subject to a different minimum standard than those executed or extended on or after 628.13. I will go through. For the solar carve out, there are actually 3 categories. So if you have a contract on or before for April 25th, 2014, that's not subject to any minimum standard. There's a middle period of April 25th, 14 through May 8th, 2016. Is subject to a smaller minimum standard, and then any contracts executed or extended after May 8th, 2016 are at 4% this year. I will have to say there is, you should be mindful that technically the solar carve out program will end next year or this year. 2023 is the last year. There are provisions for an extended year, and the regulations specify how the minimum standard is calculated, but it will be minimally, if there's any minimum standard, it will be very minimal. And we haven't determined exactly what it will be or how it will transpire, but I would counsel that just as a protective stance that you might consider, if you bank certificates or you acquire auction certificates this year, that you plan to utilize them in full next year. I can't say what will happen at this point in 2024 for the SCO program. But that doesn't apply to solar carve out 2, which goes, its last year is expected to be 2027. So just, and all those contracts, just FYI, if a generation unit was in the SCO program or the SCO 2 program, all those contracts are being converted to class 1 certificates. So some people have already gone, they've hit their 10-year period of eligibility in the SCO program. They've their SCO1 eligibility has been removed and they are just now class 1 eligible. So it will increase the size of class 1. The auction again will be held before the end of July. We don't expect significant. All deposits in the auction must be made by June 15th, so before the trading or by the trading deadline. Bidders will need to register. Nothing's new here. Register by submitting a qualification form to DOE's auction agent. And the auction will proceed as normal as it always has. So clean energy standard. Jason, can you unmute yourself? Or do I have to get you in as a participant? The big icon. Did I get him?
Hey, can you all hear me? Great. So similar to previous years, there's not really many changes for CES. All of the RPS class 1 recs will also qualify for CES, and bank certificates, you should have received notification if you had bank certificates. And the banking limit is only applied to the incremental obligation. John had mentioned that there was a new process for MassDEP for paying your invoices, and I do just want to point out as well for MassDEP, just a reminder that that is a separate process from us. So we will send out invoices in July once we've received all of the workbooks. So you'll likely receive that again this year as a PDF copy through email, but you'll also receive your invoice in the mail as well. And could you switch to the next slide for CESE?
Yep.
And I think last year was also new for CESE, same process, this clean energy standard existing. This for CESE, you can't use the class 1 recs. It's a separate generation certificate for CESE. The minimum standard is 20%. Again, you have to use the CESE certificates. What's new this year is a change in the ACP amount. It'll be $10. I believe it was $6 last year. And with the CESE, there's no banking allowed. And again, the loads prior to 2019 are exempt from CESE, so this was a new component added this year. And I think that's kind of the gist of that. If you want to switch to the next slide, I think.
Well, you could go first on.
Sure. So again, for CES and CESE, this is a separate ACP payment, and that'll be invoiced from DEP. So you'll have 30 days upon receiving the invoice. We will send those electronically as well as via the mail. If you have any issues or questions about that, you can always reach out to us. You know, if for some reason, I think last year there was some issues with payment. If you call the DEP 1-800 number, there was a bit of a miscommunication. So if you do have any questions about paying your invoices, please go ahead and direct those to either myself or Emily, and our contact information will be on the final slide.
Okay, thanks, Jason. We'll go back to the prior slide, which is the ACP process. The ACP process, payment process for RPS, APS, and CPS is that it shows on table, I think it was table 16A is the ACP for this. We'll see it when we pull up the workbook. Again, reminder, the ACP payments for these categories should be made by Wednesday, June 28th to MassDEP. We will send out next week, early next week or next week, the new wire instructions for MassDEP in an encrypted email to everybody. When you do make the payment, also please email a copy of tab N, which is the CEC receipt, to MassDEP. I'll show you the contact at the end of where to send those. I believe it's finance@massdep.gov, but I have to check that. But we have it at the end in the contacts list. Once the payment has gone through, MassDEP will return a signed ACP receipt to you. You must include that with your filing as well. If you don't make an ACP payment, you don't have to send anything. You don't have to notify MassDEP. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to include tab N with your filing if no ACP is owed. And just a reminder, if you haven't received the ACP receipt, you should go ahead and file anyway, and send that along later.
All right, I'm gonna talk loudly and hope everyone can hear me.
This is Sue Ann Richardson. We're going to turn it over to her. She's with MassDEP.
All right, for the retail seller greenhouse gas emissions reporting program, there are 2 mandatory reports that are due for each reporting year. The first report comes in as part of this workbook and has to do with your settled certificates. The second report will not be due until next year. You will get an email from us letting you know when the emission factors are complete and the reporting forms and spreadsheets are online. They will be on the MassDEP website. Again, the second report is not due until next year. You'll get an email next summer. You need to hang on to the first report because you need the data from the first report to go into the second. If you have any questions, please send me an email or give me a call. If you are outside of the US, I am not sure if I can call you back, so maybe send an email. I am happy to answer questions prior to filling out the report. It is usually the easiest way to get it done correctly. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Sue Ann. And then,
One question.
let's see. I'll take the question at the end. I see I have one at the moment. This is just the list. We're almost through this part, the list of contacts. Yeah, the finance, MassDEP information is finance@massdep.com. .gov. So, and there's our other contacts for questions or information about these standards. I will. Are DocuSign acceptable? I think the answer is yes, the DocuSign is acceptable. When was the bank certificate? The bank certificates were sent out in latter part of April. I don't remember the exact date. I can check. Or send doer.rps@mass.gov if you're missing the bank certificates. I can get that back to you, or I will send it out to you for whatever supplier you're with. Were these from earlier though? I have 3 hand raised. I'll go through these. The one who's entered as, I didn't get the name. Joshi. Does anybody else have a question? I see another question up here. The workbook will be, hopefully it'll be posted this afternoon on the website, or no later than early tomorrow. But I'm hoping that it's essentially finished. We're just going through it one more time, then it will be posted. I do have it. Let's see if I can do this seamlessly.
John, if I can just jump in for a moment, and I just want to say thanks for organizing the webinar today. And if y'all do have any more questions that come up, feel free to submit them by email. And then as well as after you look at the workbook, once it's posted, happy to field any questions. Email is probably the best way to get those questions answered quickly.
Thanks, Jason. Now can, oops. Can everybody see? The workbook? No changes to the workbook really. It's the same as in past years. You enter your contact information, name and name of supplier, and filer info. The prelim page, I've entered 100,000 here. You would enter the sub account here, the name, and then the amount of your load obligation here. So if you have nothing else, this is where you enter the load obligation that we sent to you, if it's not broken up by sub account. Down below, there is a method to categorize how you're using your SRACs, whether they're from the auction certificate or banked, or you're using them as an SRAC as class 1. And the SRAC 2 is in the table below. It's not necessary to fill it out, but it may help you in the allocation of your SRACs if that's an issue. So this number, the total, is carried forward as always to every page in the standards. We do have, there are 5 exemptions still that you can use. They all have differing dates for when the contracts are exempt. So the first one is for class 1. The contracts had to be before January 1st of 2019. The exemption for solar carve out, again, if it's before 6/28/2013, it had a smaller minimum standard, which you see, but this is where you report the number of contracts and any exemption, the amount of power exemptions that you are taking for those exemptions. Again, this is solar carve out, sing song and dance. It goes through this. Both solar carve out, I believe we have this from up here. Yes, every exemption has at the bottom is it's helpful information for us if you know the future number of contracts on what that exemption would be. This is for DOER's informational purposes only, and you're not held to it or anything. It's just an estimation of what that exemption would be in the future. So same with solar carve out 2, you would put your exemption or calculation of your forward exemptions down here. Your actual exemption would go here because it has 2 carve out periods. That's why the table is bigger and the headings are sort of self-explanatory of when they would apply. CPS has a exemption as well. I think it's before January 1st, 2020. Again, you would enter your exemption here, projections down below. And then the CESE exemption, as Jason said, is before October 4th, 2019. So you'd enter that amount here and the number of contracts here. The errant, this is where if you have unusual certificates where they didn't get settled correctly in GIS or they got settled to a wrong account, this is where you report those certificates. Doesn't happen all that often, but if you do have errant certificates, this is where you show them. Then first standard is RPS class 1. Again, if you see the 400,000 in here, what the calculations do work, this one works forward. The overall calculation would be 20% of 100,000 is obviously 20,000. It backs out what the solar carve outs are because those are part of the 20,000. It's just explaining to any newcomer. So then the net RPS class 1 is 14,370. We didn't fill in any of this. If I filled in that you had say 14, let's say you filled in 14,000. You can see that the amount of ACP requirements has gone down to 370. You have 14,000 certificates that you utilized for compliance. It reduces automatically the amount of alternative compliance. If I go back on that, you can see if you don't have any certificates, the obligation is 14,370, and your ACP due would be based on 14,370 because you didn't post any banked or errant or regular settled certificates. And in this case, just going, the banking limit here is based on the 14,370. So you have a limit of 4,311. So you could go up to that limit for banking for next year. And that if you had 100,000 load application. And then you also could add additional certificates if you were planning to use them as green certificates. You would also report them here. So basically, the workbook is the same, calculates the same, if you had exemptions, it would be reported in this column. This column would be less than 100,000. So then those would be these minimum standards. This standard would be based on the exempt load, and this standard would be based on the remaining. That works for the same for any category that has exemptions. Works the same way. Scope 2 has more exemptions, so there's more columns here. This would be automatically filled in from the exemption page if there were any. The load would, just the load comes over from the exemption page here. RPS doesn't have an exemption, so it's just based upon the minimum standard is 3.6. So the requirement on 100,000 is 3,600. And because we didn't show any class 2 rec settle, the ACP shows as 3,600. Same with waste to energy. Again, we're in the middle of a 5-year period where the waste to energy is at 3.7%. After 20, I think it's 26, could be 25, it goes back to 3.5%, but we're in the middle of where it was increased by 0.2%. APS, same song and dance. CPS, CES, we work backwards because we at a point we I may have, that one may need to be checked because it should back out the RPS class 1 categorization. We'll fix that before it goes out. This is why we do a final check. It was correct at one time, but somehow it's not now. And then the CESC shows different. You can never put anything in the bank columns, so that's why they're blacked out. We do keep tabs if somebody oversupplies on CESC, how much that oversupply is, but that's what's good. The other thing I should mention in the errant, this number here, this is the same for every page. The number here comes from the errant tab number 4. So you should still enter the number of errant certificates up above. What it does is whatever number you hear, the sum should be equal to the number that's carried over from tab 4. So you see, this is the greenhouse gas page.
All right, this should be a fairly simple form to fill out. You are going to fill in certificates in the blue boxes in row 16. The certificates come from the programs listed in row 13. However, the easiest way to actually complete this form is to only concern yourself with 4 columns over on the left-hand side of your GIS certificate report that cover Massachusetts eligible RPS Class 1, RPS Class 2, RPS Class 2 waste to energy certificates, and CESE. Once you filter on those, you can determine the number of certificates you have for each of the fuel types in columns C through K. That said, the only other thing you will need to do other than those 4 eligibility columns is search on the fuel type for fuel cell certificates. And cell J16 is for fuel cell certificates. It says natural gas because all of the certificates right now for fuel cell use natural gas as a fuel source, which is why it's in the emitting category, but it is not for natural gas certificates. There's a lot of notes at the bottom of this tab that say things like, this is only for fuels that are generating electricity. Please don't give us APS certificates except for fuel cell. Please don't give us solar thermal. It is not about CPS certificates and so on. Again, there's 4 columns in the GIS certificate report that you're going to care about in terms of eligibility. Everything else will start double counting. And the 1 fuel type that you will search for under the fuel type column is fuel cell. If you have any questions, again, please feel free to call or email. I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue Ann. This is the green page where you would enter any certificates that you were used. They have to be class 1 only, and green. You do not report your reserve GIS reserve settled certificates here. It's only if you had excess class 1 that you want to report as green. Those would be identified here. It does flow through. What happens is it flows through to a future year. It reduces what we call the budget in the RGGI program in a future year if you had voluntary green certificates here. The ACPs is going to be all filled out because we didn't provide any certificates. All it is, so if you had to pay all ACP, you'd be paying almost $3 million on 100,000 megawatt hours. 3 million for RPS. So the top table 16A, this is what goes to MassDEP. And the bottom table, table 16B, this is what you will be invoiced from DEP. So on there you would owe a little over $1 million. But any ACP, the ACP, you know, it automatically calculates. So whatever, if you have certificates and a small amount of ACP, then the small amount gets carried over here. Nothing new or different. Certification, this is where you have to sign in both places because one is for DEP, and one is for the RPS and APS standard certification. So there is actually you have to sign in 3 places here in the authorization. That is the authorized or the certification. That's the authorized representative has to sign there. And again, e-signature is okay. You can print it out. Print it out and actually sign it and then send it, scan it, and send it as a PDF. No notary is required. The authorization form, the authorization form is on what let you fill out is on what basis is the authorized person authorized to sign on behalf of the company. That's what this form does. And you fill in here in the box what that authorization is. I mean, if you're the CFO, then you say I'm a CFO and officer of the company. That would be sufficient. Authorization, authorizing you to be the authorized representative. The ACP, this is for RPS, APS, CPS only. This is tab N. This is what you would forward to MassDEP if you had ACP payments. So at the time you make your payment or wire your payment, then you would forward a tab to MassDEP telling them or for their review, and then they would sign, here's where they sign that they acknowledge that you made the payment. Then once they send that back to you, you would include this with your filing. And finally, the contacts list. I think CEC is on here somewhere. I have to change that. So it should go to finance at, as we said, massdep.com. I'll get that changed before the final comes out. And then the contacts, general, you can contact me for any overall questions. And then primarily RPS, APS, and CPS. Emily Lamb is at Climate Strategies, and Jason, Climate Strategies at mass.gov. Will cover CES and CESE issues, and Sue Ann's email is listed there for GHG questions. So that is the presentation. Is there? Are there any other questions? Were these from earlier? These might have been from earlier. Okay, I don't see any more questions. The filing workbook will be available shortly. The instructions will be available early next week, although we've gone through basically what what the instructions say. And then contact us if you have any questions. So, thank you for your time. I appreciate it, and we'll talk to you next year.